All right, we are streaming live on Facebook. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is John with Murder by the Book for another Facebook Live event. Tonight, we're really excited to have Andrew Pyper with us. He's here to talk about his newest book, The Residents. He is the internationally best-selling author of 9 previous novels, including The Demonologist, which won the International Thriller Writers Award for Best Hardcover Novel, and The Killing Circle, which was selected as a New York Times Best Crime Novel of the Year. How are you tonight, Andrew?
I'm very well. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure.
So if you guys are watching on Facebook, if you have any questions for Andrew, you can drop those in the comments. After he and I have chatted for a little while, I will relay those to him. So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about the new book, The Residents?
Sure. It's a haunted house novel or a horror novel, a supernatural thriller. Its genre, I guess, can be debated, but set in the White House. Specifically, it's a haunted house novel set in the White House based on true events. So specifically the administration of Franklin Pierce from 1853 to 1857. Franklin Pierce is probably, until very recently, until the current administration perhaps, among the lowest ranked presidencies and probably the least well known. But he was someone that I had never heard of before I stumbled on, not him, but his wife, Jane Pierce, First Lady of Franklin. And what I found interesting about her was that she suffered, and they as a couple suffered unimaginable loss before moving into the White House. Specifically, Jane lost all 3 of her 3 children within weeks of the inauguration. And the last of her children to perish was Benny, who died in a bizarre train derailment just weeks before moving into the White House. And when she did move in, she wrote letters to Benny, pleading with him to return to her. And according to her letters, he did. And so that's a historical fact that's in her correspondence. And when I accidentally came upon that, I thought, okay, there's a novel here. I have to write it.
So were you actually able to read any of her letters as part of your research?
I was. It's difficult because her letters are unavailable, but they're very hard to read. I mean, the legibility of her letters are make them highly questionable and open to interpretation, which is interesting from a fictional point of view. Is that you can sort of maybe place emphasis in one place, subject, according to one's subjectivity. But we do know from the letters that she did this. She did openly address Benny and ask him to come back to her. And she reported at a later date that he did. And I read it not in a metaphorical way, that she wasn't saying, oh, he comforted me in my dreams, or I felt his presence. But she describes him being materially there with her in her bedroom by her bed. And so that I took that seriously. And in the writing of the novel, I took her reportage of Benny's return and ran with it.
So in the process, you mentioned not knowing much about Franklin Pierce, and mentioning that kind of a lot of people don't know much about him. So in the process, do you feel like that made it easier for you to write the story because people didn't know it already? Or do you think it was harder because you felt like you needed to educate people about it?
I think it made it easier from a novelist's point of view, in the sense that there was greater liberty in, not maybe, stepping on a reputation that, that everyone had maybe felt they were in agreement about. He wasn't I don't even know if there are Franklin Pierce supporters, but he's not regarded as a great man. And so there was a sense of freedom of not hurting anyone's feelings. Having said that, on a maybe more craft basis, there was an opportunity to fill in gaps because his administration hasn't been written very much about relative to others. There are gaps, not just in the historical account, but gaps in their personal relationship. So the Residents is, yes, it's a haunted house novel, it's a horror novel, it's a thriller, it's about true events, but it's really about their marriage. Franklin Pierce and Jane, who were very, very different people. Franklin was I think of him as almost like the proto-telegenic American politician, in the sense that he was, from a very early age, recognized as very capable. He was athletic. He was handsome. He looked like a leader. He looked like a president, even if he perhaps lacked the personal qualities that ought to go into that position. And Jane, on the other hand, was the youngest of three sisters, physically fragile, frequently sick. She has suffered from all types of illnesses. Her two older sisters were considered the more attractive, pretty ones. They were more fun at the dances and stuff like that. So you'd sort of think, well, there's the more natural pairing. But Franklin chose Jane. And that question, why did Franklin choose Jane, and why did Jane choose Franklin, was a question that, in fact, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the novelist, who was a great friend, a college friend of Franklin's, asked Franklin, why Jane? And I'm paraphrasing, but Franklin's answer to Hawthorne was, I was the only one who could take care of her. And I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but that was one of the main impulses for me in writing the novel, was what brought them together. Because I'm just, as an aside, I'm fascinated by marriages. Why did people find each other? And I have a working theory that there's secrets, not necessarily dark, malicious or malevolent secrets, but I think marriages are formed by intimacy and privacy and secrets that only couples know the contents of. And so that was I think that was really the impetus for the novel, was why those two, why they stayed together, and what was their secret.
So randomly, my husband is a history teacher, and I asked him if he knew much about Franklin Pierce. And the bit of information he gave me is, if you Google handsome presidents, the first link that pops up is like hottestheadsofstate.com, and Franklin Pierce is rated like the #1 in the list of like the most handsome of all of the presidents. So there's there's my one little bit of trivia about Franklin Pierce that I know. So one of the things I think that horror novels do really well is they give people a place to explore kind of relationships and things that are kind of not monstery, that scare us, in a way that's kind of a safe way to explore it. Like you said, like marriage, secrets, and things like that. Why do you think that people feel more comfortable kind of exploring those things kind of in the confines of a horror novel?
That's a great observation. I think that what horror does, and it elicits fear. And I think fear, what makes us afraid, what we're afraid of, what gets under our skin, is a mystery to ourselves. And I think there's a lot, we can describe ourselves very competently in terms of our skills, our shortcomings, perhaps our anxieties, our desires. We're all quite articulate when it comes to those things. But when it comes to not just what we're afraid of, but what makes us afraid of them. I was just this past weekend up at our cabin up north, and we had a guest who was very afraid of snakes, and she was specifically afraid of snakes falling from the sky and falling on her head. And yeah, right. So it's and I wanted to know why snakes, but then also why snakes falling from the sky, and she could not answer it. And I think that's very typical for most of us, and I think it's akin to our desires, our sexual desires, right? I mean, so we feel there's certain things that excite us sexually, other things not. We cannot explain why that is. That is our nature, or it's just part of us, and yet it often comes as a surprise to us, right? I think over our life, we're surprised. We're always discovering what is the full nature of our desires. It's not a dead file, right? It's always open, and we're adding things to it. And what scares us is the same. And so I think, to answer your question, I think what horror does uniquely among all the genres is that it probes those corners of ourselves that we don't typically interrogate or explore.
Yeah, it's a great way, I think, like to tell kind of very sometimes seemingly not, it's very human stories in kind of a really not human way. I think I read in an interview too that you said kind of one of the things that you wanted to explore with this was, Jane being able to process the grief for her son through all of this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I as I mentioned, I was immediately attracted to Jane as a potential character, but I was also admired her, um, not through her necessarily her public qualities, because she was called by the press as the Phantom of the White House. She was resented by Washington society for not playing the game, not having the teas and the socials and the receptions, and it was precisely for that reason that I admired her, because she, unlike so many subsequent political figures or first ladies, she didn't play the game. She I think resisted that kind of political obligation to play a part, that pageantry of Washington and the White House. And that refusal, I think, at that time in 1853, coming from a woman who was not known for her strong constitution, that was rebellious, and I think showed an acknowledgement of, look, I've lost everything. I'm in grief. I do not want to be in this house. I tried to make my husband promise not to seek higher office, and he betrayed me, and here I am, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm happy about it. And so there was that my admiration for Jane was a motivator, but I also wanted to explore what it would be like to be living with that depth of grief, and also resisting that. We know that she wrote those letters that I've mentioned. We also know that she invited spiritual mediums to the White House and conducted seances and ceremonies there, and again, in an effort to bring back the dead to her. So she was not just resisting Washington expectations and her husband in the political office. She was resisting death itself, which is such a rebellious position to take against this presumably immovable fact of our lives. I wanted to understand what went into that desperation, that form of heroism in a way, but also the cost that comes with being successful in betraying the rules of mortality.
I think it's an interesting thing to talk about too, just kind of the families of politicians, because we see the politicians themselves, and you might see like the family being trotted out on like the campaign trail and stuff like that. But just the decision to run for office just affects everybody's life, and especially for something like the presidency, would just change everybody involved's life completely, whether they want to or not.
Yeah, no, I have great sympathy. On that limited scale anyway, I have great sympathy for first families, because they are typically, non-voluntary subscribers to a bizarre life of, and if you're successful in this bizarre life of scrutiny and pageantry and fakery, you end up in a house that's not really a house. I mean, the White House is as much museum or office as it is, and symbol as it is house, and yet you are obliged to live there. And so writing a haunted house novel, one of the other things that interested me about the White House was, in any writing of a haunted house novel, having told those stories before myself, is there's always the question of like, okay, well, look, why don't they just leave, right? When the ghosts show up, why don't they just, go to the Motel 6 down the road? And that's always a challenge. It's like, okay, well, they can't because the bridge has been washed out by a storm. There's always sort of hokey explanations. But with the case of the White House, they can't leave. It's in the center, very center of America. You'd sort of, there's no physical restraint, but the tradition of the place prevents you from leaving it. And so it's a prison too.
Yeah, it seems like it would set itself up well for kind of that, being able to remove somebody from kind of the outside world. They're kind of stuck, like you said, kind of in this prison. They're by themselves. They don't have as many people around them, which definitely opens themselves up for kind of more spooky goings on and not being able to escape it.
Yeah, and yet you're surrounded by a different kind of form of phantom there. So there's staff, there's advisors, there's sort of various levels of physician, and then on the lower levels there are the people who kind of keep the billows of the place working, and yet there's this you have to live this fiction of living in a private residence when it's not private at all. So yeah, it's the most fascinating. I think it's a fascinating house to think of just as a house. And then when you invest it with the supernatural, as I've done, it really is. I don't, now that I'm maybe just, this is my own obsession, but I don't think there's any other way to think of the White House than as a haunted house.
So here's my obligatory. So do you believe in ghosts question? Do you?
Here's my dodge. I I have, I remain one of those people who's like, look, I'll believe it, I'll fully believe it when I see it kind of
Yeah.
people. However, over the last couple decades, I've been writing scary books. I don't think it's very rare that I do a public appearance, do a reading or something where someone doesn't come up to me afterwards and relate a story that they've had an encounter with the paranormal, a ghost, and so. And these people are typically intelligent, sane, sober, and they generally preface the story by saying, "Look, I don't necessarily believe in this. I'm just telling you what happened to me. That this is just a testimony," and I believe them. And not just those people I've met personally, but there's as you know, I'm sure in your bookstore, there's books of true ghost stories of Texas, true ghost stories of America. There's a literature of anecdotes and accounts and memoirs of the supernatural. To my mind, there are just too many people who have had these experiences for it to be discounted as foolishness.
Yeah. Yeah. My dodge answer is always I don't not believe. Wait, I don't believe. Wait, I had this right in my head just a second ago. I don't believe, but I don't not believe as well.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with him.
So for research for this, did you actually get to go visit the White House and see what it's like?
Yeah, I didn't. I was in Washington a couple years before I went down the sort of the Google rabbit hole that led me to Jane Pierce, and so I drew on my own sort of. I wasn't thinking of writing a Washington novel at all, but fortunately, I'd sort of done that kind of what I sort of think of as sort of atmospheric research already, and so that work had been done. So the research primarily was for the book was on two fronts that I felt was necessary. So one was the Pierces themselves. What was the nature of their administration, the political pressures that they were under and failed, frankly, to put at bay, their marriage. And then on the other hand, there was the kind of the social research of specifically what was the American relation to the supernatural in the 1850s. And what was interesting is that spiritualism was very much in fashion at that time. So people were not just sort of goofing around with Ouija boards and seances. They took very seriously and literally the exercise of going through a consultant, a medium, that you could literally speak with the dead. And that wasn't, again, it wasn't just a silly parlor game. It was a genuine practice. And that really interested me, that there was a time not that long ago when educated people believed that this is something that you could do. And now we're more estranged from that moment, I guess, maybe on one way. And yet that kind of waxes and wanes. Our belief in how thick or thin the membrane between the dead and the living isn't really a matter of science. It's more a matter of other factors, social factors that maybe sometimes give rise to a higher level of belief.
Yeah, I think we see that as well with kind of fiction and genre stuff kind of coming in and out. Like a couple of years ago, horror wasn't having its moment. In the last couple of years, we've seen Murder by the Book is primarily mystery. We've always had a horror section, but we've had more and more people come in, and so we've been looking to expand that more because just people are kind of more interested in those stories now than they have been in the last couple of years.
I'm glad to hear that.
Especially this year has been a really great year for historical horror as well. Like your book, we were lucky enough to do an event with Michael Frieda, who is writing a Scott Carson for his book that's named completely, he's just gone out of my head.
Is it The Deep?
The Deep was the
It's
Chill was Mike Scott / Michael's, and then Alma Katsu had The Deep, which was her historical Titanic. We were actually able to do. She was one of the like last. I think we hosted her in the store like March 11th, and then like at the end of that week, like all of our events for the rest of the year in store had been canceled. So it's been a really great year for historical horror as well.
yeah.
Which is great for us because all of us at the store are big historical fiction fans. We love seeing kind of those two things blended together. And so for this one, this is the first time you've done kind of historical fiction like this. So what were some of the challenges of that going in?
Oh, well, I think, primarily, the challenge that I would have anticipated, that is to say, research, that kind of the academic weightlifting of, learning the period, learning the policies, the facts, was not really the greatest challenge, because I was really trying to be very specific on learning and doing enough research to achieve what I wanted to achieve. I've had colleagues who've gone down this road before of historical fiction, and were never seen again. That you can just become so fascinated with the subject matter that you essentially get a PhD, without the potential employability. And I knew I didn't want to do that. I knew I didn't want to sort of, research Franklin Pierce for 6 years. The
Yeah.
challenge, though, was more about balancing the different obligations that I felt this story called for. So specifically, while it is a horror novel and it's a ghost story and it's about this couple and it's quite intimate in its focus, I knew I couldn't completely neglect the larger geopolitical and moral underpinnings of the story. So specifically, the factors that gave rise to the Civil War that followed only a few short years after Franklin Pierce left, namely slavery, and as well the previous kind of the foundational horrors of the United States, indigenous Holocaust and the sort of the atrocities that had been covered over by the official history. I felt obliged not just morally to cite those things, but the story would feel like it was, I think, skirting those matters if it didn't. And so that was a hard balance to strike, because I didn't at the same time I didn't want the novel to slip into I didn't want it to be a sort of, oh, this is a history book, or this is going to provide a lesson of the full freight of early American history that would have overwhelmed the story. So it was being responsible to those matters, but at the same time being light in the expression of those matters.
So how do you balance the kind of like the horror supernatural elements, the history elements, and then your books also kind of had that fast-paced thriller element. So how where do you find the balance of that? Is it while you're writing itself, or do you go back and edit for pacing, stuff like that?
A bit of both. I'm a big outliner, so I try to get a lot of those things right before I even begin writing. I really work very hard on the structure and how to. I think so much turns as book after book after book, you learn painful lessons that you wish you knew beforehand. But I think the way in, like, what, not just where you begin the story, but the carrier of the story and the sort of the tonal way you enter it is so important, and it establishes so many other things, or it undermines so many other things. But so I try to get that right in the outline, and to try to kind of like, look, where's the midpoint? Where do I have to be when a reader's halfway through? And what are the important pieces? But in this case, I did that. And then there's invariably the editing process. And so my early readers said unanimously, this is great, but we need to get to the White House sooner. And so some of the sections, almost all the sections that I excised were earlier moments in Franklin and Jane's, either their courtship, their early, their childhood. That was kind of hard to get rid of, because I felt that was it sort of provided more information about where they came from and how this horror was inevitable on a personal level. But for the sake of pace, and for the sake of sort of getting to where the reader really ultimately, understandably, wants to be, I had to lose that.
And I read in, it might have been something that you had linked on your website that you said the writing of this book was kind of different from your others because usually your other ones you kind of felt like they had been kind of been percolating in your mind for a while before you sat down to write them. But then this one kind of hit you as you were just researching and you came across this story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, it was unusual. And I had and continue to have a completely different novel outlined and teed up and more or less ready to go.
Mhm.
And as I did before I bumped into Jane Pierce. And I'd never had that experience of finding a story, or at least finding the way into a story just out there in the world as one might find like a, $10 in the gutter, and I just knew though, it just felt very right. It felt like, okay, I've been fooled before of thinking, oh, here's a great idea that you bump into. And then you realize, well, there's not really much there, or I need to add more to it. And there's a lot of invention in the residence, of course, but it did come at me like a wallop in a way that other books haven't. For me, a novel is an accumulation of ideas. You sort of have a core concept, but then in order to sort of not fool yourself, you sort of take your time and sort of glue other pieces onto this things until it gets, it becomes a whole. And this came very quickly, and it demanded attention in a way that previous books of mine have not.
So you said so you kind of had an outline that was kind of queued up and ready to go already. Is that something that you're going to go back to, or are you moving on to something different?
No, I've still got that same idea, and it's interesting. You're never the same person on the other side of a book.
Mhm.
Just in the same way that we're not the same people this year as we were last year. So I think I want to revisit it in some respects. There's another sort of angle I want to bring to it, but the core remains the same. So this idea has been very patient with me. It hasn't run out yet, and that's what I want to get to in the fall.
So I have a question from the comments. Gail wants to know if she would have to leave the lights on while she's reading The Residence.
Yes, I would recommend it, Gail. It's it's funny. I have two little kids. They're 13 and 10 now. And when they were slightly younger, still so today, but when they were slightly younger, they would often ask me to tell scary stories. And I would say, well, how scary do you want it to be? And they would invariably ask initially, oh, as scary as you can make it. And so I would, begin some story off the top of my head, and then it's too scary, too scary, too scary. So I invented the term, the scarometer. Like, where do you want, do you want it, 9 might be, 10's running out into the street screaming. 1 is just mildly unsettled, and
Yeah.
every gradient in between. I would say The Residence has maybe, sort of 2 8 moments, but for the most part, it's a 4. So I think Gail can handle it.
Um, so you said they're kind of 10 and 13. That's kind of around the age that I started discovering kind of horror stuff too. So have they read any of your books, or have they shown any interest in wanting to read any of them?
Haven't read them yet, but huge interest. So what they love to do is on like a long car trip or something these days, they'll be like, okay, Dad, can you tell us about, they'll kind of go through all the books and demand a synopsis. And so I'm like, okay, in this book, this happens. So it's basically me pitching out my novels verbally, and that gets it. They love that. And it's a
Mhm.
little, I can protect them a bit from some of the, the sort of the creepier details, but I think they're maybe 1 or 2 more years away from actually
Yeah.
reading them.
Um, so Dylan, who is a local writer, is watching, and he says, "Where would you put 2020 on your scarometer?"
Oh, that's 11. I think 2020 goes to 11.
I would agree. So speaking of that, so I know, kind of people think that writing is sort of this, oh, I mean, I know that it can kind of be this kind of very solitary profession where you're used to sitting at home all day, kind of working and writing. So now I know it's a little bit better in Canada than it is here in the States. So now that we're kind of all stuck at home, or luckily get to be at home, um, have you still been able to sit down and write, or are you just not able to focus at the moment?
Yeah, it's a different time, right? And as
Mhm.
you mentioned, I think it's really different for everybody. It's funny how I'm now hearing sort of reports of friends or colleagues who are maybe initially doing well, when the pandemic arrived, and now are kind of not doing well on maybe at an emotional level. And then of course there's all the professional challenges that people are going through, and I think frankly will continue to go through for the foreseeable. On a for me, on a working basis, I haven't I've been lucky in that I had a couple of side projects lined up that on the sort of the TV and film and audio drama and things that weren't novels. And so I've been writing scripts and doing a lot of Zoom meetings and pitching and doing work with people in LA and that kind of stuff, which has been exciting. But in a way, if I'm to be totally honest, it has also tricked me into thinking, you're fine, because you sort of, you get ready for the meeting, you prepare these smaller nuggets of work, these little pieces, and it's still not writing a novel. So I'm not yet able to answer your question because I haven't written a novel in this new condition yet. And I don't know, I really don't know whether it'll be harder or easier or just totally different.
Yeah. And do you think that this current situation with the pandemic and kind of the lockdown, is that something that you think that might work into your books, or do you think that that's something that's maybe it's just too scary and you're just going to avoid?
I would be reluctant to build it into the story. I think because I think there's too many books that are even coming out now that are either anticipated it. I think about Paul Tremblay's new book among others. But so I think my reluctance would be A, people are already doing it. B, man, that's depressing. Even for a horror novel, it's depressing. And C, I think if I did do it, I think if I was to write, a contemporary story, as I am about to do, I think I would build it in, but build it in a way that would be really shorthand, really kind of like, here's people with, here's a mask, or here's a place that's closed down. Not lean into it, but just kind of, because that is our reality now, of course, right? I mean, and so it would be a lie to ignore it. But I don't think I'd want to write a novel about it.
So you would sort of just kind of acknowledge that it had happened in the course of what you were working on.
Yeah. It just sort of build it into the environment.
Yeah. Right when stuff started closing down, people online were talking about wanting, like, now's the perfect time to read Emily St. John Mandel Station 11, which is a really great pandemic book. And on Twitter, she was like, yeah, no, guys, find something else to read. Now is not the time to read this book. Go read the completely opposite. You don't need that. So Wendy asks in the comments, which of your novels do you feel is the scariest?
Ooh. Well, as I was saying earlier, I think that, even though I have the scarometer, the scarometer is really idiosyncratic. It's so I have some readers who have expressed to me, like, I've read most or all of your books, and this one really scared the hell out of me, and this one less so. And so it's highly variable and very, very, very personal. I think for me, the story that scared me probably to write the most was The Demonologist from a few years back, because it was about a man more or less my age who loses his daughter, who is more or less my daughter's age at that time, and loses her to an apparent suicide, but he believes she was taken by a demonic force. And so he goes on this grief-driven, probably insane quest to recover his daughter. And that was hard. That was scary for me to write, because I had to imagine what it would be like to have lost my daughter, that's just in itself really scary. And then it was the only book that kind of almost sort of summoned. It's the only kind of, you were mentioning earlier about, have you ever seen or I was mentioning if I'd ever seen a ghost. And while I hadn't, when I was writing that book, there was a scene where a very, a climactic scene where the main character, it's revealed to him that when he was little, his brother, who he always knew had drowned, was in fact drowned, not accidentally, but drowned by his father. And so there's a scene where he sees this horrible act happening, and then he sees his brother float by in the river. And that night, my daughter came into our room, and she was terrified. She was having a scary dream, and she stayed the rest of the night in our bed. And in the morning, I asked her, what was your nightmare about? And she said, Daddy, who is the little boy in the river? And I had not told her about that. I mean, of course, I would never have. She was little. I didn't tell her about that. She didn't know about that. Couldn't have overheard. She didn't know I was writing because I wasn't even telling my wife I was writing that scene. And I think it was just that, that sometimes within families and relationships, there can be a mind meld. But that was the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me related to my writing.
Wow. So with the supernatural elements to the books, do you do research for that as well? How much of that do you base on kind of existing myths or kind of science around it? And how much of it do you just kind of make up to fit the story?
A bit of everything. I'm obsessed with reading, true accounts of the supernatural, because I shy away from, in my stories, making things overly fantastical or having the scale of the horror get too large. So I don't have, I don't have tentacled monsters. I don't veer into the cosmic horror or the monstrous horror very much, if at all. My books are very, the horrific elements are typically fairly quiet and only sort of make, extremely violent or deliberative appearances fairly late in the game. I like to, I sort of sometimes teach writing workshops, and I say that my goal in writing a scary story is to set things up in a way that the thing that makes the reader kind of, jolt is, a glass of water tipping over on its own, or it's something that's very small in the face of it, but it's invested with such architecture preceding it that it's horrifying without having, okay, now a giant spider's now come in and it's eating everybody's heads.
I think those are the things that are scariest too. Like, I mean, it's one of the reasons why like The Handmaid's Tale is such a terrifying book, because all the stuff that Margaret Atwood put in there was either kind of happening or like that close to reality. So it was so plausible. Those are the things I think that make it all kind of the most terrifying, is that knowing that it's possible and it could potentially happen.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. That's the space I want to live in, and to sort of have that. Yeah, it's grounded. It's an overused word, but I think it's useful in this respect, that you want to keep things, not have it sort of just. I don't like it when we all have different tastes, but when I read horror, which I love to do, I'm always disappointed when a story moves into a more sort of comic book space, or I don't want things to be silly. I want there to be a degree of, of seriousness brought to it.
So you mentioned being a horror fan. So who are some of your favorites, and what's something that you read recently that you really loved?
Oh, well, I mean, you can't really talk about this genre without, of course, acknowledging Stephen King, who was very influential on me. Probably everyone who writes in this genre. I love, and then it gets down to sort of specific books. So I really love, and urge everyone to read Sarah Grand's book, Come Closer.
Oh yeah, that's it's a store favorite. Like, we order, like, every time we're out of it, we just order like 20 of them, because we know at some point we're going to sell through them, because like every staff member just loves that book so much.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. That is a terrific, wicked little book. Yeah, maybe I'll just sort of stop there in the recommendations, because I just want more people to read Sarah Grand.
And if you're watching, I'm going to drop a link to Come Closer in the Facebook comments, so you'll know which book it is, because yeah, it's definitely one worth picking up. I'm going to you mentioned Stephen King. We were really lucky this past weekend. He did a virtual event with us where he chatted with James Lee Burke, who writes the Robichaux books.
Mm-hmm.
And when we found out that we were going to be able to do this virtual event with Stephen King and James Lee Burke, I mean, every person on the staff was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe this." And he was really kind enough to log into the Zoom thing early enough for us to all be able to say hi. And he was the nicest guy. He was the most gracious. So if you guys are watching, you can also check that out on our YouTube channel. And when we're done chatting with Andrew tonight, Facebook will archive this video, so you'll be able to watch it, but you'll also be able to catch that on our YouTube channel as well. And also, just one of the great things about Stephen King that we were talking about is how he's just so generous with up and coming writers, how he's, if he reads thrillers, he reads horror, and if there's something that he loves, he's so generous about kind of letting everybody know about it, which I know everybody appreciates so much.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So if you had, we get this question all the time. So if you had any advice to offer to somebody who was just starting writing, what would you tell them?
Oh, yeah. I think the only maybe, genuinely and 100% guaranteed useful thing I could say is to, I think a lot of people get disappointed early on because they write something and they're excited about it, and there is something, inherently there is something good about it, and they send it out, whether it's to an agent or a magazine or a journal or a publisher, and they do so too early, and then the work is rejected, and they feel disappointed, and rejection is hard, especially when you sort of, when it, especially in the early days. You get used to it over time, but it's hard, and then becoming discouraged, and they lose confidence, and they just like, you know what, screw it, I'm out. And so my advice would be to hold on to whatever you're working on, whatever the story or the novel. Hold on to it. Get people to read it. Do so. Ask to do so with great respect, because if you can get an intelligent reader to give you honest criticism, you may initially feel like, well, hold on, no, I want you to just love it. So take their criticism seriously, treat those people with kindness, because they're doing a great service to you, and just mull on it long enough. Read it out loud. That's, if you don't have friends who are prepared to read it, that's a great, cheap and cheerful way to edit a piece, is to read the whole thing out loud to yourself, because you'll catch stuff that reading a thing on the screen or on the page 25 times is invisible to you. So only send it out, only submit it when you can honestly look at yourself in the mirror and say, this is the best I can do. I'm not just fooling myself. This is really, really the best I can do. And then press send and feel confident that you did your best. Because otherwise, I think it can be spirit breaking when you submit things prematurely.
And can you talk a little bit about the process of how you got started with writing? I know that you have a law degree but you don't practice. So can you talk a little bit about how you became an author?
Sure. I was writing all through my 20s, or even before that. I mean, I was writing little stories. I was one of those kind of read a lot kids, wrote a lot kids. I was a de facto only child. All my siblings had moved out of the house, so I was on my own a lot. So I had to entertain myself a lot. And I was saying the other day, this is in the days when there was still genuine boredom, right? There wasn't just sort of constant, there wasn't just a screen to just kind of throw crap at you. You had to kind of create your own crap. And I was very lucky for that. And so in my 20s, went to at university. I was studying English literature just because I loved to read, and was sending out stories to journals and getting accepted in places. And Stephen Heighton, who is a Canadian author and a colleague of mine, unbeknownst to me, was an editor at one of those places, and he sent some of my stories to an editor at a small press here in Canada, who called me and said, well, we want to publish a collection. And I hadn't even submitted. So that was very, very lucky to have someone support me in that way. And then, so I published a small short story collection, and was still thinking, okay, that's wonderful, but I'm not going to make my living doing this. So I went to law school thinking I'll make my living doing that, and hated it. I mean, I knew, okay, I'm not going to be a lawyer. I don't know what I'm going to be, probably a bartender, but I'm not doing that. Finished the degree, and meanwhile, still sending out. And then I wrote a novel after graduating from law school. It was basically a reward for completing this task. And I had, on the basis of the short stories, an agent reached out to me and said, I'll be your agent. And I said, great, but I have nothing for you to sell. And she said, well, you will. And so I gave her this novel, which was it turned out to be the novel Lost Girls, my first novel. And she sold it. She sold it. She sold it in the States and Canada, and a bunch of translations and film rights, and all in a space of a week. And yeah, it kind of blew my mind. And I sort of thought, okay, well, that's enough money to keep me doing this for another year. And I've just been kind of kicking the can down, year after year of just continuing to do the work. I've been very, 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 very lucky. And but it's a, there's not even, there's never a moment, including the moment we're living in now, where I sort of feel like, well, I feel safe. It's a hell of a way to make a living, because not because it's unpleasant, but because there's zero job security and zero kind of sense of what the next month will bring.
Yeah. And especially now, publishing in the current environment where, like we were talking about beforehand, like a lot of stores aren't open. Was there any talk about potentially postponing the release date for the book?
There wasn't in this case. I brought it up kind of quietly, sort of, back in March, April, sort of like, what's going on, guys? And they thought, well, look, I think rightly so, that in the case of The Residents, a ghost story set in the White House, given that the election's in early November in the United States, this is a book that you wouldn't push back. This is a book that it has to come out now. And then there's Halloween, of course, next month too. So yeah, the logic for this in this case was very persuasive. But I know I have a lot of colleagues who either advocated for holding the book back or going early or trying to. But maybe I don't know if there's any real way to avoid the reality we're in now. I think it's just it is what it is. I didn't want to quote the president, but yes, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's been just as, like I said, I'm the event coordinator at the store. So we have literally set up, publicists have set up whole virtual tours. And then a week later, they're like, oh, wait, we decided that we're going to push the release date for this book back like a month or two. I'm like, oops, let's set all of this up again. Or there were even things that we were setting up in March. We were like, oh yeah, that event's going to be in June. Like, oh, June's not a problem at all. And now we have publicists asking, like, what do you think February is going to be like? And we're like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
We've got fingers crossed that people can come into the store for events, but we're not sure. So yeah, it's definitely a crazy time. So we've got a couple more questions before we head out this evening. So you, as I mentioned in the bio, that you were the author of 9 previous novels. What is something that you think all of your books have in common, despite them all being kind of standalone novels?
Oh, well, I have very poor insight into my own work. So I rely on the insights of my readers, who are, definitely smarter on these matters than I am. And someone pointed out to me about a year ago that in answer to that very question was that, that what frightens my characters or protagonists, or the thing that truly haunts them, isn't the ghoul or the monster or the demon or the ghost, but it's loneliness. And I think that's true. I think I don't know why, but I'm fascinated by the consequences of loneliness and the corrosive effects of solitude, unwanted solitude on people. And I'm very sympathetic to people who live with grief or loss. And so that, I think that is the thread. I think that is, for, I don't know why psychologically, but that I think is turning out to be my life's work.
So you mentioned that you haven't started on another novel yet, but you're working on some other projects. I know The Residents was just sold, was it to TV?
Yeah, so to Skybound, which is the production company that most famously produced the Walking Dead series. And so we've developed it, TV series for The Residents that's kind of unique. It's a hybrid, kind of half documentary, half fiction. So it would be, half, roughly speaking, half of the episodes would be historians, as well as occult specialists, spirit mediums, talking about the time and the circumstances and the facts behind the story. And then the other half would be dramatizations, extrapolations, fictional kind of jump offs of, in the case of, season 1 would be the Pierces, and potentially going on to tell the history of the White House through subsequent administrations and the unique ways in which they were also haunted, because the lore and the not just the lore, but the accounts of supernatural events in the White House certainly don't begin and end with the Pierces. And so we've got some, hopefully I was pitching it over the summer, and I think we've hopefully found some traction in a home, but it's a little too early to talk about.
That's fascinating. That sounds like a really awesome concept for a series. So we'll keep
I
our
think it'd be
fingers
fun.
crossed. Yeah. So based on that and kind of just like you said, kind of other seasons potentially tackling other issues, do you think that you would potentially write more books kind of set in the White House and maybe spin it off as sort of kind of an unofficial series where you were looking at those things?
I don't know. I think if you'd maybe asked me that like 2 months ago, I'd say no way. But if let me put it this way, if the TV project doesn't go, I might be tempted because I think there are really some great stories there that I would prefer it to be a series because it would be frankly quicker. It'd be sort of like, oh, let's move on to the next one. The next one would be, sort of novels take longer, but I would be compelled to tell it one way or the other, I think.
Very cool. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you guys have caught us in the middle of this interview, we've been talking with Andrew Pyper about his new book, The Residents, that just came out this week. We have copies of it available at Murder by the Book. Our website is murderbooks.com if you want to order online. We have just started with appointments. So if you guys are local and you want to come visit us at the store, if you just visit the store website, you can book an appointment or give us a call and we can get you on the schedule. We're also still doing curbside pickup. So if you're not comfortable getting out in the world again, we can continue to do that again. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been really fantastic. Hopefully by the time the next book comes out, things will have righted themselves and hopefully we can do this actually in Houston in the store.
I'd love that. Thank you so much for the invitation.
My pleasure. Take care. Have a good night.
You too.
Thanks.